So Jesus is the great high priest, and he does all the work in a heavenly sanctuary. And so the earthly, as I said, is based on the pattern of the heavenly. Okay, we see here in the book the Great Controversy 429 and 430. But clearer light came with the investigation of the sanctuary question. They now saw that they were correct in believing that the end of the 2300 days in 1844 marked an important crisis. But while it was true that that door of hope and mercy by which men had for 1800 years found access to God was closed, another door was opened, and forgiveness of sins was offered to men through the intercession of Christ in the most holy place. One part of his ministration had closed, only to give place to another. There was still an open door to the heavenly sanctuary where Christ was ministering in the sinner's behalf. Now was seen the application of those words of Christ in the revelation addressed to the church at this very time. These things saith he that is holy, he that is true, he that hath the key of David, he that openeth and no man shutteth, and that shutteth and no man openeth. I know thy works. Behold, I have set before thee an open door, and no man can shut it. Okay, so this is showing that because Christ entered into the most holy place, into the final phase of his ministry, didn't mean that his intercessory work was done. Such was the service performed unto the example and shadow of heavenly things. And what was done in type in the ministration of the earthly sanctuary is done in reality in the ministration of the heavenly sanctuary. After his ascension, our Savior began his work as our high priest. Says Paul, Christ is not entered into the holy places made with hands, which are a figure of the true, but into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God for us. That's Hebrews 9:24. This is from Great Controversy 4:20. And we're continuing there. The ministration of the priest throughout the year in the first apartment of the sanctuary within the veil, which formed the door and separated the holy place from the outer court, represents the work of ministration upon which Christ entered at his ascension. So when he ascended, there was his intercessory ministry. It was the work of the priest in the daily ministration to present before God the blood of the sin offering. And so we're dealing with Leviticus chapter 4. Also the incense which ascended with the prayers of Israel. Okay, which of course was also dealing with ministration, with the daily ministry and intercession. So did Christ plead his blood before the Father in behalf of sinners and present before him also with the precious fragrance of his own righteousness the prayers of penitent believers. Such was the work of ministration in the first apartment of the sanctuary in heaven. Hebrews 8:1-5. Now this is the main point of the things we are saying. We have such a high priest who is seated at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in the heavens, a minister of the sanctuary and of the true tabernacle which the Lord erected and not man. So clearly there's a heavenly sanctuary. For every high priest is appointed to offer both gifts and sacrifices. Therefore it is necessary that this one also have something to offer. For if he were on earth, he would not be a priest, since there are priests who offer the gifts according to the law, who serve the copy and shadow of the heavenly things, as Moses was divinely instructed when he was about to make the tabernacle. For he said, see that you make all things according to the pattern shown you on the mountain. So that pattern was a pattern of heavenly things. Hebrews 4:14-15. Seeing then that we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold fast our confession. For we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weakness, but was in all points tempted as we are, yet without sin. So Jesus is our great high priest, Exodus 25:9, according to all that I show you, that is the pattern of the tabernacle and the pattern of all its furnishings. just so you shall make it. So the earthly sanctuary is based on the pattern of the heavenly. Exodus 25:40. And see to it that you make them according to the pattern which was shown you on the mountain. Exodus 27:8. You shall make it hollow with boards as it was shown you on the mountain, so shall they make it. Again, this idea of the pattern being shown to Moses on the mountain. Ellen White writes on Great Controversy 421, thither the faith of Christ's disciples followed him as he ascended from their sight. Here their hope centered, which hope we have, said Paul, as an anchor of the soul, both sure and steadfast, and which entereth into that within the veil, whither the forerunner is for us entered, even Jesus, made an high priest forever. Neither by the blood of goats and calves, but by his own blood he entered in once into the holy place, having obtained eternal redemption for us. Hebrews 6:19 and 20, which I was talking about, which yes, he did enter into the most holy place, and he entered within the veil, and that was for inauguration, though, not for the Day of Atonement. Hebrews 9:12. For 18 centuries, the work of ministration continued in the first apartment of the sanctuary. Okay, so the first apartment ministry is being pointed to here, referring to the work of Christ in his first apartment ministry. Now again, that doesn't mean he was separated or confined away from the Father, but this is using language that is related to the earthly sanctuary. The daily first apartment ministry is the shadow, but again, the heavenly, we cannot limit Christ's heavenly apartment ministry by the earthly. Continuing reading here. The blood of Christ pleaded in behalf of penitent believers, secured their pardon and acceptance with the Father, yet their sins still remained upon the books of record. See? When it says they're on the books of record, that means it's a record of sin. As in the typical service, there was a work of atonement at the close of the year, so before Christ's work for the redemption of men is completed, there is a work of atonement for the removal of sin from the sanctuary. And so what is that talking about? That's talking about the record of sin. We have to read it in context because we're talking about what is on the books. That's a record. Okay, actual sin isn't on a book. Actual sin happens in a person's life. This is the service which began when the 2300 days ended. At that time, as foretold by Daniel the prophet, our high priest entered the most holy place, or the most holy, to perform the last division of his solemn work to cleanse the sanctuary. Okay, so there's a sanctuary in heaven, and we're dealing with the holy and most holy place in heaven. But does that mean we should separate the Son from the Father and limit and really confine Christ in heaven? No, we can't do that. We can't limit the heavenly. But we're talking about ministry, okay? That's the focus. On the earthly sanctuary, the holy place is signifying the work of the priest throughout the year. The most holy place, only the high priest entered, okay? But these two phases of ministry point to the work of Christ. And so when we talk about the heavenly holy place and most holy place ministry of Christ, we cannot at the same time limit Christ by the earthly. We can't do that because the earthly is the shadow. Thus, those who followed in the light of the prophetic word saw that instead of coming to the earth at the termination of the 2300 days in 1844, Christ then entered the most holy place of the heavenly sanctuary to perform the closing work of atonement preparatory to his coming. It was seen also that while the sin offering pointed to Christ as a sacrifice, and the high priest represented Christ as a mediator, the scapegoat typified Satan, the author of sin, upon whom the sins of the truly penitent will finally be placed. When the high priest, by virtue of the blood of the sin offering, removed the sins from the sanctuary, he placed them on the scapegoat. When Christ, by virtue of his own blood, removes the sins of his people from the heavenly sanctuary, in other words, removes a record of sins, at the close of his ministration, he will place them upon Satan, who in execution of the judgment must bear the final penalty. The scapegoat was sent away into a land not inhabited, never to come again into the congregation of Israel. So will Satan be forever banished from the presence of God and his people, and he will be blotted from existence in the final destruction of sin and sinners. So when a person reads this and they say, when Christ, by virtue of his own blood, removes the sins of his people from the heavenly sanctuary, well, obviously their sins was removed from then. But how are their sins removed from the heavenly sanctuary? Well, they're removed from the record. In other words, this is the record of sin that's being removed at the close of his ministration. He will place them upon Satan. Now, does that literally mean that just as a high priest literally of the Old Testament laid his hands on the head of the goat, that Jesus is then going to lay his hands literally on the head of Satan? No, that's not what that's speaking about, but that's using language. She is clearly using the language of the Day of Atonement of the Old Testament to speak about what Jesus is doing in the heavenly sanctuary as our great high priest. So she's using that language. But remember, the Old Testament is the shadow. And the substance, the reality, is what we're dealing with as well. But she's using this language to explain that. And so this is ultimately pointing to how Satan, when it says he will place them upon Satan, it's not that he's literally coming out of the sanctuary and then laying his hands on the head of Satan and doing that. It's basically using that language of the Old Testament to talk about how Satan is going to bear the ultimate responsibility, who in execution of the judgment must bear the final penalty. Okay? So when we look at this language here, when we read again of Christ then entering the most holy place of the heavenly sanctuary, this doesn't remove the idea that Christ entered into the most holy place, into the presence of the Father upon inauguration. But this is pointing to the fact that Christ enters into his final phase of ministry. Again, she is using the language, the symbolic language of the Old Testament. Okay, yes, there is a heavenly sanctuary. Yes, there is a heavenly throne room. Yes, Jesus is our great high priest. But again, when we're dealing with the language of the shadow of the Old Testament sanctuary system, that's the kind of language that's being applied to the heavenly. But that is not to limit Christ and say, well, he must have not been in the presence of the Father, and there must have been a veil separating them and all of that, because clearly we know that's not the case. Christ is not separated from the Father in the heavenly sanctuary. But we're dealing with phases of ministry as represented by the symbolic language. Okay, this is prophecy. And in this case, we are dealing with the language of the Old Testament sanctuary. So symbolic aspects. Here we see, again, some other writings of Ellen White where we could see the symbolic aspect that we cannot take literally. Here in February 1845, I had a vision of events commencing with the midnight cry, Ellen White is writing. I saw a throne, and on it sat the Father and the Son. I gazed on Jesus' countenance and admired his lovely person. The Father's person I could not behold, for a cloud of glorious light covered him. I asked Jesus if his Father had a form like himself. He said he had, but I could not behold it. For, said he, if you should once behold the glory of his person, you would cease to exist. Before the throne I saw the Advent people, the church, and the world. So she's saying she's seeing that before the throne. Is that literally before the throne? No. Again, this is a symbolic language, and this is a prophetic vision, obviously, that she's speaking about. She's speaking of a vision where she's seeing these things. And so we have the symbolic aspect, because before the throne I saw the Advent people. Were the Advent people literally, with the Seventh-day Adventists of that time literally standing there? Are Seventh-day Adventists of all time literally at all time standing there before the throne? The church and the world. I saw a company bowed down before the throne, deeply interested, while most of them stood up, disinterested and careless. Those who were bowed before the throne would offer up their prayers and look to Jesus. Then he would look to his Father and appeared to be pleading with him. A light would come from the Father to the Son, and from the Son to the praying company. Then I saw an exceeding bright light come from the Father to the Son, and from the Son it waved over the people before the throne. But few would receive this great light. Many came out from under it and immediately resisted it. Others were careless and did not cherish the light, and it moved off from them. Some cherished it and went and bowed down with the little praying company. This company all received the light and rejoiced in it, as their countenance shone with its glory. And I saw the Father rise from the throne, and in a flaming chariot go into the Holy of Holies within the veil, and did sit. So here we see an image, and it's telling us within the veil. Again, we're seeing a vision, and vision often has symbolic languages. So we're seeing within this vision language that clearly points to the Old Testament shadow of the earthly sanctuary. There I saw thrones that I had never seen before. Then Jesus arose from the throne, and the most of those who were bowed down arose with him. And I did not see one ray of light pass from Jesus to the careless multitude after he arose, and they were left in perfect darkness. Okay? So they're before the throne, and yet they're in perfect darkness. Again, symbolic aspects. Those who rose up when Jesus did kept their eyes fixed on him as he left the throne and led them out a little way. Then he raised his right arm, and we heard his lovely voice saying, "Wait here, I am going to my Father to receive the kingdom. Keep your garments spotless, and in a little while I will return from the wedding and receive you to myself." So you can clearly see there are symbolic aspects to this vision. And I saw a cloudy chariot with wheels like flaming fire, and angels were all around it as it came where Jesus was. He stepped into the chariot and was borne to the holiest where the Father sat. There I beheld Jesus as he was standing before the Father, a great high priest. On the hem of his garment was a bell and a pomegranate. Then Jesus shewed me the difference between faith and feeling. And I saw those who rose up with Jesus send up their faith to him in the holiest and pray, "My Father, give us thy Spirit." Then Jesus would breathe upon them the Holy Ghost. In the breath was light, power, and much love, joy, and peace. Then I turned to look at the company who were still bowed before the throne. They did not know that Jesus had left it. Satan appeared to be by the throne, trying to carry on the work of God. Now, obviously, Satan is not physically by the throne of God in heaven, but this is a symbolic vision. I saw them look up to the throne and pray, "My Father, give us thy Spirit." Then Satan would breathe upon them an unholy influence. Okay, again, symbolic imagery, not to be taken literally. In it there was light and much power, but no sweet love, joy, and peace. Satan's object was to keep them deceived and to draw back and deceive God's children. I saw one after another leave the company who were praying to Jesus in the holiest and go and join those who were before the throne. And they at once received the unholy influence of Satan. So again, look at that last sentence. I saw one after another leave the company of those who were praying to Jesus and go and join those before the throne. Okay? And so this is the throne. This is the throne of God, okay, which is in the holy place, in the heavenly sanctuary, where it is said that Satan appeared to be by the throne. So again, in this broadside of April 6, 1846, paragraph 7, we are definitely seeing symbolic aspects. Again, when a prophet sees a vision, when we see the visions of prophets in the Bible, we definitely see that there are some symbolic aspects.